Welcome to the Broadband Breakfast Club for May 2011. The title of our event is, Will the FCC or the Justice Department be tougher on the AT&T T-Mobile merger? And before I introduce the moderator, I just want to thank our sponsors, ICF International, the National Cable and Telecommunications Association, NCTA, the Telecommunications Industry Association, TIA, and US Telecom. Please join me in thanking our sponsors. I also want to point out to you that there are surveys on your table. We really value your feedback, so we hope you can fill it out before you leave. But if you don't have a chance, you can take it home and send it to me. And I will also point out on the back of your program, we have our upcoming events of the Broadband Breakfast Club. The National Broadband Map, Policy, Consumer, and Economic Implications is on June 21st. And Making the Universal Service Fund into a Universal Broadband Fund is July 19th. So now I'll introduce our moderator, Jonathan Charnitsky. He's the managing editor of BroadbandBreakfast.com. Jonathan began his career as a journalist before turning his focus to law and policy. He's an attorney in Texas and the District of Columbia, and has worked previously as a political reporter in political campaign communications and the Hill. He holds a BA in journalism from the University of Washington and a JD from Villanova Law School, where he focused his studies on internet and intellectual property law and policy. Please join me in welcoming Jonathan.
Morning, everybody. All right, and thank you for attending this month's Broadband Breakfast Club, the FCC versus the DOJ, who will be tougher on the AT&T T-Mobile merger. As you all know, in March of this year, AT&T, the second largest wireless carrier in the US, announced a $39 billion deal to acquire fourth largest wireless carrier, T-Mobile. Immediately, news of the deal sparked concerns of further concentration in an already highly concentrated marketplace. In reviewing such a merger, the Federal Communications Commission and the U.S. Department of Justice shared jurisdiction to determine whether the merger would be in the public interest and whether the combination would violate federal antitrust laws, respectively. After the FCC gave the go-ahead to a condition-laden Comcast-NBC Universal merger earlier this year, and with the apparent political will behind the current deal in the name of deploying national wireless broadband, questions have arisen about the veracity of the agency's review of the AT&T T-Mobile merger. So this morning we've assembled an expert panel to take a closer look. Our panelists from your left to right are, first, Gus Hurwitz, visiting professor of law at George Mason University and a former DOJ antitrust attorney. Alan Pierce, PhD, president of Information Age Economics and a former chief economist at the FCC. Debbie Goldman, who is telecommunications policy director and a research economist at the Communications Worker of America. Ernesto Falcone, Director of Government Affairs at Public Knowledge, and Carrie Bennett, General Counsel of the Rural Telecommunications Group. So to start off, I'd like each of you to tell us a little bit about your organization or former organization for our first two panelists here, and tell us a little bit about the direction from which they will be approaching this merger. So Gus, go ahead, start us off.
Thank you for having me here. It's really a great pleasure to be here this morning. I currently am a visiting professor, assistant professor at George Mason University Law School, and previously spent several years at the Department of Justice Antitrust Division Telecommunications section, which is the section that is reviewing this transaction. And the most important thing to know about the Antitrust Division approach to reviewing transactions like this, and definitely this transaction, is the inquiry is focused on competition issues. As we will hear, I'm certain, from Dr. Pierce, the FCC has a broader question that they look at. They look at a public interest standard. For the DOJ, the question will be, is this transaction likely to substantially lessen competition? Importantly, the DOJ doesn't need to be convinced of this. The DOJ carries a burden of proof, if they do believe that this is a problematic transaction, of going to a federal judge and convincing the federal judge that this is a problem. Whereas with the FCC, the chairman need to be convinced that it is affirmatively good. So That is the question that the Department of Justice will be asking. Is this transaction likely to substantially lessen competition? Now, in terms of how they do that, the probably most important factor to understand about their process is they will be conducting this analysis on a local market-by-market basis. They will not be looking at this as a nationwide market. And this is how both they and the FCC have historically approached transactions like this. The reason for this is the concern isn't where these services are available or where they may be used, but where consumers go to purchase these services. Does the competition exist for these services at the nationwide level, or as a consumer, do you go to your local Verizon or AT&T or T-Mobile or Sprint or Metro PCS store to purchase your cell phone? Most people go to a local store. If you live in Virginia, you don't go to Kentucky to buy your cell phone and get your service contract. And the question then is there some level of local or regional competition occurring? And historically, it has been the case that companies like AT&T do have regional promotions and regional sales efforts, and individual store managers have some ability to compete directly with other firms in their local market. We'll get into all that. No need to, I'm certain, no need to say everything right now. The other comment that I'd make at the outset is the DOJ will almost certainly be working with the FCC a great deal in evaluating this transaction. The DOJ and FCC are not competitive organizations. They are peer organizations. Their inquiries are complementary, and their processes really feed into one another and benefit one another. So the question, which will be tougher, might be a bit of a misnomer. They certainly, I think, will be working together throughout this process.
Okay, thank you, guys. And Alan.
Thank you. Well, I agree with everything that Gus just said, with the exception of the market-by-market approach. I think that this is such a big deal and has so many implications attached to it that the barriers against affirmation of the deal are pretty high. And I think the FCC is aware of that, the Justice Department is aware of that, the states are aware of that, and I believe that Capitol Hill, the US Congress, and certainly the White House all are actively involved in this. It's such a big deal. Its importance far outweighs the $39 billion that AT&T is promising to pay for T-Mobile for this. And even the kill fee, if this deal is not approved, T-Mobile comes away from it with $6 billion in cash and other payments, the other payments including AWS spectrum and a roaming deal that AT&T has thus far refused to work on with T-Mobile. So I'm here today looking at it as I did in 1971 when, as chief economist of the FCC, we began the investigation of Western Electric and its affiliation with AT&T and the 25 Bell operating companies, which resulted in our close collaboration with the Antitrust Division of the Justice Department and the breakup of AT&T in 1984. The reason I need to highlight that is that I think that began a wave of incredible technological innovation in this country. And the telecommunications information entertainment industry, which is now a merged industry, has proliferated in its economic importance. It's now a vibrant part of the economic and socio-cultural ecosystem, not just of the United States, but the entire world. So with that as a backdrop, big deal, major implications, major hurdles for AT&T. Let's take a look at what the government review process will be, beginning with the Federal Communications Commission. Gus was absolutely right. The FCC has a broad mandate here, and so broad that it could even look at the $25 billion that AT&T will pay T-Mobile, Deutsche Telekom, the German telecommunications company, and see whether that detracts from the President's broadband deployment initiative in the United States. Would that $25 billion be better spent in the United States? I mean, with my accent, I can't be xenophobic and jingoistic, but you have to think this is $25 billion in cash that's going to Deutsche Telekom, and that might be invested in Greece, you know, good for Greece. I have nothing against Greece, love the country actually. But is that good for US ratepayers? And lest we forget, the United States Congress gave the FCC a broad mandate to look at deals like this beginning in 1934, when it said, and I love this act, the 34 Act, and some of my friends who are in the audience have heard me say this many, many times before. It says that all telecommunications technologies and services based thereon must be made available to all Americans on an equal, non-discriminatory, non-preferential basis at affordable rates. And the FCC generally determines what's affordable. And that is a magnificent piece of legislation. I salute the US Congress, for which I worked for 3.5 years. So Congress isn't as bad as a lot of people think it is. That's a great act. It gives the FCC a lot of power to get into this. And the FCC used that act in 1971, Section 215. Again, this still pertains today, transactions between and among telephone companies and their affiliates relative to services, equipment, and so forth. Now, lest we forget, if we look at the history of AT&T, it has interfered with the available of new technologies and services to the general public of the United States, which is against the congressional mandate under which it operates. And so that historical fact will have to be looked at the FCC. And so the FCC is going to have a rigorous and I think a prolonged investigation of this. And again, as Gus said, more about this later. Looking at the Justice Department, he's absolutely right. And he and I were joking before the panel began. I worked as a consultant for the Antitrust Division when I left the government in 1979 on the AT&T antitrust suit. We started it at the FCC, finished it at the Justice Department before Judge Green. And it's very simplistic. The Antitrust Division, and Christine Varney, the head of it, has a very simplistic role, which is, you know, one competitor is better than no competitors, two competitors better than one, three better than two, and so on. A kind of a simple arithmetic formula. That doesn't do it today. I think she has to expand her role to look into issues that we'll be able to discuss momentarily. Moving now from the DOJ to the US Congress and the White House, both of those entities are now preoccupied with economic recovery and debt and things like that. I don't have to remind you of the major issues confronting Congress and the White House, especially given the headlines in today's newspapers. But that will fold, those issues will fold into this big deal because of the $25 billion that goes directly to Germany if this deal is approved, and also other factors bearing on the deployment of broadband for all Americans, those in rural areas, which we'll be hearing about later, jobs, which Debbie will presumably be talking about after I've finished my probably too long introductory remarks already. So you've got to, I want to focus the attention not on local market-by-market analyses, DOJ, but broader public interest concerns that have to do with jobs, which is one of Debbie's preoccupations, and GDP, and new imaginative, innovative technologies and services based upon them made available to all Americans on an equal, non-discriminatory, non-preferential basis in rural America and urban America at affordable rates.
Thank you, Alan. And Debbie, tell us about the Communications Worker of America.
Thank you very much. I think I agree completely with your goals, Alan, but I disagree with your view that this transaction is going to stand in the way of realizing the goals. The Communication Workers of America represents the men and women who service, maintain, build, and sell the wireless and wireline networks in the United States, and obviously our members, 700,000 of which about half of them work in communications, have a deep interest in seeing that this is a growing, dynamic environment with respect for workers' rights, respect for the ability of workers to share in the benefits and the progress as we develop our vibrant networks. And unfortunately, as you all know, because you come to the Broadband Breakfast Club, our nation is not in the forefront of broadband networks. We have 12 to 24 million Americans who do not have access to any kind of broadband whatsoever, even at a very low definition of broadband. We have 100 million Americans who do not subscribe to broadband. Either it's too expensive, or they don't see the value, or they don't know how to use the technology. And we rank 25th in the world, behind not just Japan and South Korea, but countries like Romania, in the quality and the speed of our broadband networks. So we have a long way to go. And it's our view that this transaction, the combination of the assets and the spectrum of T-Mobile USA and of AT&T, is going to be one step, not the step, but one step in moving us forward in getting the kind of goals that Alan talked about: affordable, universal, high-speed broadband to all Americans. And as you've seen, AT&T has committed that as a result of the spectral efficiencies and the financial efficiencies and the use of combined assets, AT&T has committed that they are going to build out their high-speed next generation 4G LTE, that's a mouthful, isn't it, network to 97% of the population. And it's our view that they have the resources, and because of the spectral efficiencies, which I will wait to the question period to discuss, but they're real, they'll be able to do that. However, we also believe very strongly that as the FCC reviews this merger, as it's done in other mergers that we at CWA have been very involved in, they should put not just a voluntary commitment, but they should put timetables and benchmarks and penalties and data reporting to assure that that is indeed a result of this merger. And I would note that in past mergers we've looked at, whether it was CenturyLink and Embark, CenturyLink and Quest, Frontier, some of the divestitures that Verizon did to Frontier, that there were benchmarks put in for broadband deployment. Benchmarks, I would say, that are far less than what AT&T is committing to right now, because all the technologists say that this fourth generation wireless is going to be able to provide about 10 megabits per second downstream. That's enough to do 2 channels of high definition TV. That's quite a step forward. It is not a replacement, I would underscore, for robust wired networks. You need a combination of robust wired and wireless networks in this country in order for us to be at the forefront and realize all the benefits of broadband for job creation, economic competitiveness, healthcare, education, public safety, et cetera. And let's not assume that this is cheap. The FCC did a study, what would it cost to build a national 4G public safety network? And they came up with a figure of net present value, $41 billion in CapEx and operating expenses. So this is not cheap. We know that T-Mobile was putting itself up for sale. That is a basic fact that has been lost in some of this debate. We're not talking about, were we going to have a market structure that would be preserved going forward? We were talking about what was going to happen to T-Mobile. T-Mobile's German parents, Deutsche Telekom, had determined that they were not going to put capital to build a 4G network in America before they did it in Germany. And this was a decision of the board. And I can say, although we're not privy to any private information, CWA has a very close relationship with the union that represents 90% of the Deutsche Telekom employees over in Germany. That's called Verdi, VER.DI. They sit on the board. There's a very different labor relations in Germany. They sit on the board. They have a full partnership there. Unfortunately, not the same situation has not carried over here. But it was clear, and you can go back and read statements by both the management of Deutsche Telekom as well as by all analysts that were following, that it was clear that T-Mobile did not have a future in America. They did not have 4G spectrum. They were not going to put capital in to build and upgrade their network. They had adopted a competitive strategy of being the low-cost carrier, and even with that competitive strategy, they were losing customers. So this was not a company of growth. And we know the employees because CWA has been in a relationship with many of the T-Mobile employees who want collective representation. They don't have it now. And they were concerned about the future of their company, increasing pressure on the employees in the call centers and the retail stores because of the decline in the business. So the question really is, what is the best future for the assets of T-Mobile? And it's our view that AT&T, a strong, financially healthy company, good bond rating, lots of capital, lots of revenue, and of course we would say the most trained, motivated employees who are CWA members to use those assets and move forward in our broadband world. Let me just add one other thing to the point, and I really regret raising in our global economy the issue of what's going to happen. Is there going to be capital repatriated to Germany? But I have to respond because we've looked at that question. In fact, the Germans invested over $23 billion when they bought VoiceStream, and then they invested more when they bought another small company here. So this was German capital coming into the United States to invest in networks. It was a flop. They made a mistake. It was a bad investment from their point of view. But they have been taking dividends out of the United States. In fact, this is not going to be a case of repatriating billions of dollars. Rather, it's an opportunity to invest in America and build the networks that we need to compete and to provide the quality of life, particularly to rural America that's being drained of their young people because there is no future in our small towns. Broadband build out there, and this merger will move us forward to address that and build a more sustainable, thriving economy.
Thank you, Debbie. And Ernesto, tell us about Public Knowledge.
So, Public Knowledge is a DC-based public interest organization, and we address the public stake in and maintaining a competitive market in the telecommunications world. Thank you for inviting Public Knowledge to speak here. My name is Ernesto Falcone. I'm the Public Knowledge's Director of Government Affairs. On this merger, as my boss has made clear during the last hearing we had last week, we do not see how this merger can be approved if antitrust law or the public interest means anything anymore. Prices would go up, innovation would decrease, and competition would reduce as a result of this merger, and antitrust law is meant to prevent these three outcomes. I have to disagree with the assessment that the market will be only looked at in a local by local framework, because that presumes that the agency cannot, but based on past decisions, that it has no way to look at any new type of merger, and this is unprecedented in its size. I mean, previous mergers that the agencies have looked at have been, a large company go up like a regional. You didn't really have as much of an overlap in markets. These two companies are two national carriers that overlap about 97% across the country. There's no reason why the agency shouldn't look at it as a national market. I mean, has anyone ever seen local prices, regional prices, prices that are unique to Arlington, Virginia versus Sacramento, California? I mean, the carriers advertise and they price their product on a national scheme because it's a national service. And that's not just me making that argument, that's AT&T making that argument when it purchased Singular, it was AT&T making that argument when it purchased Centennial, it was Verizon making that argument when it purchased Alltel. They've all argued that it's a national market. It's only now, all of a sudden, where it's inconvenient to look at it as a national market under antitrust, because you're going from 4 to 3, that now they argue it's a local market. I think overall, the impacts on consumers and competition is fairly dramatic. The Department of Justice already operates from the presumption that in highly concentrated markets, like the current wireless market, that consumers can be significantly harmed when the number of competitors, as I was saying, goes from 4 to 3 or 3 to 2. And that's exactly what would happen if AT&T purchased T-Mobile, because Sprint would then either be a merger target or would essentially be crushed by the vertically integrated giants, AT&T and Verizon. By DOJ's own merger guidelines, this merger already exceeds the thresholds that register when competition issues occur, as well as market power issues. So over the coming months, I think DOJ will analyze this merger based on what it means for competition, what it means for innovation, and what it means for consumer prices. In terms of the Federal Communications Commission, Alan mentioned the broader mandate of the Communications Act and how it has to be viewed through the public interest standard. So that essentially will include things like, what does this merger mean to openness in devices, what it means to the open internet, what it means to broadband adoption, affordability. I'm very confident that after a thorough analysis of the facts, that both agencies will block this merger, of AT&T's merger with T-Mobile. And that's in the issue of synergies and public interest benefits that Debbie mentioned. I take issue with AT&T's claims because there isn't one single public interest benefit that AT&T has promised that will not already occur in today's market. We talk about 4G 95, 97% coverage. Well, it used to be 95 and then it got upgraded to 97. Verizon's already committed to converting its network from a 3G to 4G network by the end of 2013. You have rural carriers that are looking to try and do 4G in their own rural markets, and Verizon's going to work and have roaming agreements between the two companies. I mean, there's no reason why we have to lose competition, to move the market back into a duopoly state that existed in the 80s. In order to get 4G coverage in 97% of the country. As we've stated a number of times, if AT&T is willing to give Deutsche Telekom $39 billion, maybe it would be better for AT&T to invest that $39 billion in its own network to address all the capacity issues and meet the goals that it promises to meet by eliminating competition. So with that, I look forward to discussing this merger further, and thank you again for inviting me.
Thank you, Ernesto. And Carrie.
Hi, I'm Carrie Bennett. I'm General Counsel to the Rural Telecommunications Group. And for those of you who may not know who the Rural Telecommunications Group is, RTG is a group of very small rural wireless carriers. Each of our members has under 100,000 subscribers, and we set that 100,000 thinking that was really, really high. To date, only one of our members has 70,000 subscribers. Most of our members have under 10,000 subscribers, and out of the ones that are under 10,000, I'd say probably 60% of them are under 5,000. We even have members that only have 200 subscribers. So we're very, very small. We're trying to compete sometimes with the big guys. Lots of times the big guys aren't even in our markets. And so when I hear someone say that AT&T is going to build out to rural America, that gets me very worried, because AT&T has been in this business since the 80s, and they still haven't built out to rural America. They have tons of spectrum that they're sitting on in rural America. It's just not getting utilized. And the sad part is, if we try to approach them about using that spectrum, they won't let us have access to it. So we have carriers that are out there willing to serve, but not any spectrum to utilize. Some other things that we looked at when we first heard, when the merger was first announced on a Sunday, we all got our heads together really quickly and thought, wow, what kind of conditions can we get placed on this merger that would be useful to rural consumers? And when we started thinking about those conditions, we thought, well, handset exclusivity is a big deal to us. We can't get access to handsets in rural America. We don't have access to the iPhone or some of the other phones that are exclusively in Verizon's and AT&T's domain. So we thought about that condition. We thought about interoperability as we try to build out LTE in 700 megahertz. We're on certain pieces of spectrum that will not be interoperable with Verizon, and we'd like Verizon and AT&T to work together to make that spectrum interoperable, because right now they're building networks that are silos. A Verizon customer can't roam on an AT&T LTE network at 700, and neither can an AT&T customer in the future roam on Verizon. So we'd like to make that interoperability a condition. And then we thought about some other conditions, and then we thought, wait a minute, we've had conditions placed on mergers in the past. With Singular and AT&T, there were mergers. They have not followed the merger conditions that were placed on them by the FCC. So why would we think down the road they would follow any conditions that are placed on this merger? Then we got really worried, and we thought about the Alltel-Verizon deal. Same issue. Problems with conditions are that they are not upheld down the road. And that's when we decided to join the No Takeover Project. And no conditions will make this palatable to any of our members, and that we are going to oppose this thing tooth and nail, and it will be a battle to the death. So I'll leave on that note.
On that ominous note.
And let me say one more point. As you all sit here eating your breakfast, and you had the bacon, and you had the eggs, and you had the fruit, remember where that comes from, and think of the wireless technology that has made that very efficient to grow our produce and our meat and everything that we eat out in rural America. And for rural America grows a lot of food for the rest of the world too. If we lose wireless technology as a result of anti-competitive conduct that we think and we know and we've experienced in the past from AT&T, and that happens again, your food's going to get really expensive, your milk's going to be really expensive, everything that you put on your table will get much more expensive. So urban America is affected by this.
That's a much better ending than a fight to the death, I will say that. Now, Gus, let me start off with you here, and then I'm going to open up to audience questions fairly quickly. Now, I heard, and correct me if I'm wrong, from both Debbie and Ernesto, that, interestingly, that you're on opposite sides of this issue, that you'd both like the assessment to be on a national basis rather than a regional basis. No, I'm sorry. Okay, Debbie, I had that wrong then. But you know, there has been a significant call to have this evaluated on a national basis rather than a regional one. Why does the DOJ look at this on a regional basis when you've got national carriers involved?
Right. So that is probably the $39 billion or so question in this transaction. And it shouldn't be. It actually, in many ways, doesn't matter. Before I get to that, I just want to respond or re-emphasize something that Debbie said. The question fundamentally for DOJ isn't, does this transaction make things better? It's, does it affirmatively make things worse? You need to remember, T-Mobile was on sale. We are not looking at a world where we're going to have the 4 major carriers where that we have today moving into the future. The question is, given that fact, does this transaction make things worse? And that will be the sort of analysis that the DOJ is going through. So you really need to imagine not that we're comparing the world with the merger to the world with 4 carriers, the 4 national carriers that we know today. It's, you need to compare the world with the merger to the world of the 3 national carriers without T-Mobile. That will be how the DOJ is thinking about this. Now, to the question of national versus local markets, the most important thing I think about when thinking, does the national versus local question really matter, is that this is not a binary decision. We've heard 2 viewpoints that this transaction, no conditions will make this transaction acceptable. It's either no transaction or yes transaction. The Department of Justice, in all likelihood, is going to require AT&T and T-Mobile to divest many dozen, possibly hundreds of local markets. In the Alltel-Verizon transaction, DOJ and FCC both required over 100 markets to be divested by the merging companies. We're going to see the same thing here. When you start looking at this through the framework of local divestitures, there really is no difference between a market-by-market analysis where markets where you have competitive harms require divestitures and a national analysis where you would require divestitures in order to make the national merger palatable. So once you look at this through the non-binary lens of how do we make this, what can we do to make this transaction acceptable under the antitrust laws, really the distinction between local and national in many ways falls out. It's only important when you want to say this transaction has to be rejected entirely, that the national versus local distinction matters.
Okay, and I would solicit, if anyone wants to respond to that, let me quickly ask, I mean, you said that you're not going to have T-Mobile going forward. Why could an independent company that is not AT&T, Verizon, or Sprint come in and buy T-Mobile?
Do you have $39 billion?
I don't, but a lot of people do. I mean, I'm throwing it out there as, well, more. So, Ernesto, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the exact question. It's you know, it can't sell to AT&T because that would violate antitrust law. And therefore, once that determination is made by the regulatory authorities, Deutsche Telekom will have to figure out how it could sell T-Mobile without violating antitrust law. I mean, I can't predict the future. You know, and as John has noted, there are a lot of people that are willing to buy a profitable company if it is on for sale. $39 billion is actually fairly highly overvalued what T-Mobile's price is at. And you know, I think some honest questions should be asked. Well, why would AT&T be willing to spend so much money to take T-Mobile out of the market? There might be some additional benefits that AT&T solely can receive by taking the fourth largest national carrier out of the system. You know, I think the dynamics of T-Mobile also changes with the breakup fee. I mean, AT&T talks about needs spectrum, but $2 billion of spectrum assets are being transferred to T-Mobile if they were denied by the federal government. So I think it's presumptive to assume that just because AT&T is first up in this process, that AT&T is the only buyer that exists in this market.
Does anyone else have a response to that? Debbie?
We know who the other potential buyers were. There was a hedge fund that at one point was looking at buying the assets. A hedge fund does not bring expertise in running networks, building networks, and doesn't have a skilled workforce to do that, doesn't bring that kind of knowledge. So that was not accepted. Then there was Sprint. And we ought to look carefully at the difference, because I think there is a real difference. It's easy to throw around the idea that there could be another buyer to make the best use of these assets. But in fact, AT&T and T-Mobile use the same technologies. And therefore, in terms of the current networks, the voice networks and the 3G data networks, and they are really 3G networks at this point, even though they're advertised on TV as 4G. Those networks, until people turn in their handsets, and even with incentives apparently, it's difficult to get people to switch from their current handset to a new one. AT&T needs to run those networks, will be able to immediately merge the T-Mobile assets, spectrum, cell towers, cell sites, which are very dense, with their own. Sprint couldn't have done that. They have different technologies. And let's look at what's happened with the Sprint Nextel merger. 6 years later, and they still haven't merged those technologies. It's draining a lot of resources. They don't have a history of good integration. And so there was another potential bidder out there, and people know who followed this. 2 years ago it came up, just right before March it came up again that Sprint was a potential buyer. But there must be a reason that T-Mobile did not choose to be bought by Sprint, and a lot of it has to do with their fears of the technological integration. The Sprint Nextel merger is considered to be the poster child of a bad, poorly integrated merger, whereas AT&T has a lot of experience of integrating. So I think that they would be able to use these assets both to deal with the current problems, and nobody in this room can say that there aren't problems with overcapacity. AT&T was the first out with the iPhone, then the iPad. They have a huge amount of data traffic, and quite frankly, their network in some cities doesn't have the capacity. And by the spectral efficiencies that would come out of this merger, they'll be able to both improve the quality of service, that customers are getting fewer dropped calls, faster speeds, as well as build out in the rural areas. And I'm sorry if your folks don't want competition, which is what I heard in the rural areas. But
that's not what I said. I said that AT&T has spectrum and refuses to build out their network in rural areas.
Well,
so they could have competition, but they aren't coming and providing that service to rural Americans. And in fact, let me just interrupt you for a second and let you hear a story of true anti-competitive behavior on AT&T's part just recently. One of our members who AT&T roamed on, I can't go into the details, but they did something totally off subject that AT&T didn't like. They pulled all the roaming revenue off of that network and closed the company down, to the harm of their own consumers who are not able to access the network, in violation of the singular AT&T merger order, where the FCC told AT&T, you cannot prevent your customers from roaming on another carrier's network if you don't have a network there. And this company is now out of business as a result of that. And there are consumers that had iPhones that were in rural areas that were using the rural carrier's network who didn't have any access. Their phone service just went dead. Now, I don't think that's very consumer friendly on AT&T's part. I don't think the FCC will find that in the public interest, and I suspect that DOJ will find that that's anti-competitive behavior on AT&T's part to eliminate a potential competitor.
Well, I want to underscore that there are a lot of issues that are going to be reviewed by both the DOJ in terms of, and I would emphasize, and just maybe you can help us out, it's not really, the antitrust laws don't look at whether there's elimination of competition. They look at whether this is a reduction, an increase in market power that's going to harm consumers, correct? Because any merger potentially can reduce competition, but it could be approved. So the antitrust laws are a little more specific. But before I stop, I just wanted to also emphasize that as a part of these reviews, we are fully supportive if there are conditions that the FCC considers important to protect the public interest, that they should be done as a result of this merger.
If I may respond to a couple things and answer that question as well. Once again, I think that I have a large number of points on which Debbie and I agree, a couple of which I want to emphasize or flesh out a little bit in other directions. First, it's really easy to think it's not complicated to run one of these companies. It's really, really hard to find people who are competent to run a wireless company that serves millions of customers. It's really, really, really hard to find a wireless company that can offer service to tens of millions of customers, and that's what we would be talking about here if we were looking for another buyer. To think that a hedge fund, for instance, could operate T-Mobile is really, really difficult to think that they could successfully do it. The DOJ in prior transactions has required a large number of divestitures, and the divested properties need to be operated by a management trustee. And the DOJ is always struggling to find people who have the necessary experience to successfully operate the divested properties until they can be acquired by an appropriate buyer. And that level of difficulty is really magnified when you're looking for someone to buy a company as large and complicated as T-Mobile is. And the point about the incompatible technologies, really AT&T is the only network out there, as Debbie said, that has competence and a similar technology that could be successfully integrated without incurring years of work and probably billions of dollars of cost. The Sprint Nextel transaction, it's not just a poster child for a bad transaction, it was a $10 billion write-off for Sprint. It likely is in many ways why Sprint is where it is today. It was really detrimental to Sprint. One other point that I want to make, one thing that I hear frequently about this transaction is why doesn't AT&T take this $39 billion and invest it in building out actually using the spectrum that they have right now. AT&T has been building out, investing billions and billions of dollars every year. This takes time. Buying T-Mobile, because of the compatibility of the technologies, this is in many ways a turnkey solution that will be able to get AT&T in a position where they are able to compete with Verizon as they work to transition to LTE and pre-4G and ultimately 4G technologies. Verizon right now is light years ahead of where AT&T is. So if we're concerned about competition, we should be concerned about competition at all parts of the market. Right now, in many ways, on the LTE 4G front, Verizon is almost a monopolist. If we hamper AT&T's ability to compete with Verizon, is that going to be good or bad for competition? Now, in terms of the technical point, what is the legal standard that the Department of Justice will be using to review this transaction? It is a question about competition. It's whether or not the transaction is likely to substantially lessen competition. Now, the word substantially in there is very, very important. There are offsetting synergies. You need to compare the hypothetical world with the merger with a hypothetical world without the merger, the competition in those two worlds, again, not with the competition as it exists today. So it's a very complicated question, especially in a dynamic industry like this. It's easy to look at the market shares and just do an HHI calculation and say, oh, under the merger guidelines, this is clearly an anti-competitive transaction. Even if you just take a even if you are okay taking a national approach and you get to that outcome, you need to look at the dynamic nature of competition in this market. It's really not correct to say that because the HHIs are high, this is an anti-competitive transaction. That would be okay if this were a static market where the companies were never innovating and where all companies in the market were selling homogeneous goods, not differentiated products that were rapidly evolving over time.
Thank you, guys. Now let me actually use that as kind of a segue from the DOJ's mandate in reviewing this transaction to the FCC's, which is significantly broader and looks at whether this merger will be in the public good. So, Alan, tell us a little bit about that and what factors, I mean, what is the public good in the eyes of the FCC for a merger such as this?
Well, before I get into the public good, and this is part of the public good, I think I can dismiss the hedge fund threat, because the FCC has rigorous rules about telecommunications, information, entertainment companies having the professional, technological, and financial expertise. So a hedge fund, it would be like somewhat north of 1,000 to 1 getting T-Mobile. The FCC, looking at this transaction, the FCC will be internally advocating a very micro research data-based approach to many of these issues, plus others raised this morning. For example, they will be looking at what happens to T-Mobile if the deal is rejected, if it falls apart for any reason. And that's why I raised the $6 billion payoff by AT&T to T-Mobile in that event. That was a good deal for T-Mobile and may give it the kiss of life and may give it an opportunity to survive for a while independently as a standalone company. I don't know that for a fact because I've not yet looked at it, but I know the FCC in its issues, it's asked all people interested in this deal to provide a list of issues that are integral to its review process by the 31st of May, the last day of this month. And we should all begin to look at those issues. And I and my colleagues have already developed 22 such issues, one of which is what will happen. We can ask the question, what will happen to T-Mobile if the deal isn't approved? What will happen to T-Mobile if the deal is approved? What will happen to AT&T/T-Mobile if the deal is approved? AT&T, like many companies, when it's given the power, it asserts that power. How is it going to assert that market power? It will undoubtedly, if the deal is approved, I think any economist, any lawyer with antitrust experience will know that this deal is being done by AT&T for what reason? To give it more market power. There's no such thing in a free market as free market. There's no such thing as a level playing field. We're all trying to steal a fair or an unfair competitive advantage, and that's what's at the root of this, and that's what the FCC minutely is going to get into. It's going to get into a plethora of issues that we don't have time this morning to discuss, but those are just a few of them. Again, going back to what Debbie said about my asserting that this deal was bad or whatever. I didn't say that. I said it's going to be given an intense review because of the broad implications. I'm stating the truth. The truth is that there are broad implications. How is it going to affect equipment supply, exclusive contracts? I've been there before. I was at the FCC when AT&T said you couldn't buy your own telephone. They even wanted you not to buy your own computer and plug it into the public switch network. They didn't want Nextel to interconnect with the public switch network. They opposed. I'm giving you historical facts. The FCC is the body of historical research on this company. And we, as members of the public, have a right. As Americans, I defected to the United States and became one by choice. So I'm asserting my freedom of speech and American one rights to look at this merger in cool, calm, collected terms. What is it going to do for the American public? Some people can get iPhones, some people can't. Other countries don't allow that to happen. They don't allow exclusive arrangements between manufacturers and suppliers of services. I advocated that position, as a matter of fact, when I was the chief economist at the FCC. I also proposed the separate subsidiary concept in Computer One. And some of those issues have fallen by the wayside, and I think they're now going to be to resurface and be analyzed for the first time in many years. And the thing about today is that it's a burgeoning industry throughout, as we've seen throughout the Middle East, in China, in India, all over the world. Access to these networks is absolutely essential for our economic socio-cultural ecosystem. And so that's why this is a big deal. It's not going to be decided by June of this year. It'll be lucky if we get it decided by the spring of next year, in my opinion. And that's all I'm advocating, a policy-neutral analysis of all of the issues that will surface by the end of this month, beginning of next month.
If I may, Jonathan.
Go ahead.
A couple of responses to that. First, I want to agree entirely on the point that this is going to be a long, data-intensive investigation for both the DOJ and FCC. The agencies are looking at months of just collecting data about each and every local market, who operates in the markets, what are the regional promotions that may or may not exist in the markets, how have things happened over time in the markets. This is going to be a data-driven, data-intensive, as most merger investigations are. An important question is a couple of important issues that I'd like to highlight that are going to definitely be on the map for DOJ and likely will be very important for the FCC. It's less clear whether or not the DOJ would be able to consider these in its investigation, but they definitely will be working with the FCC to address them or raise them with the FCC under its broader mandate. Is there a difference between 4G and 3G in terms of markets, or pre-3G and 3G and post-3G? Are these two separate markets, or is this all one wireless market? This largely goes to the point that Alan makes about market power. Is AT&T doing this transaction to get market power so that it can crush its smaller competitors who aren't doing 4G yet? Or is it doing it so that it can get market power that it needs in order to effectively compete in 4G against Verizon? Those are two very distinct questions, possibly. One has very clear pro-competitive benefits. One has potentially anti-competitive benefits. That's going to weigh heavily for the agencies. In terms of the handsets and devices, there are two related questions. The exclusive deals for handsets, I think that the general understanding today is that is a generally pro-competitive sort of arrangement that puts advanced handsets more quickly into the hands of more people and helps fund companies and give companies like Apple an incentive to spend billions of dollars developing new, really exciting handsets. However, there are important questions about handsets. One issue where I have a great deal of sympathy, especially for the rural carriers, is roaming. And the ability for carriers to get fair roaming agreements with the nationwide carriers, especially for data agreements. I think that that is an issue that is orthogonal to this transaction per se. However, in the context of a consent decree, you likely are going to see some language about it. The FCC has been doing very important work to get mandatory roaming, and that's an area where we really need to see continuing development. I personally expect that the future of this industry, especially as we transition to 4G, is the nationwide carriers are increasingly going to become more akin to wholesale providers of wireless data. Now, AT&T and Verizon fear that future. They do not want to be wholesale data providers. But in the long run, that is likely the direction, it's the direction I personally hope that we go. It's likely the direction that the industry is going to be going. And in order for that model to work, you need to have roaming, the viability of roaming agreements. The last issue that I want to highlight, and this is where I think the exclusive handset agreements really becomes an interesting and challenging topic, is will the agencies require or will the carriers allow unlocked handsets onto their network, especially as AT&T and Verizon both converge to a single common standard, LTE. If when you buy I don't think that there's a problem if when you buy a handset that's subsidized from AT&T, they say you can only use this handset on our network. But what if you go out and buy that same handset from at retail prices from the manufacturer or someone else? There's a strong argument that then, because it isn't subsidized, you should be able to use it on whichever carrier you want, and you should be able to switch between carriers, especially, for instance, as we've seen the proliferation of prepaid and month-to-month contracts. That's another issue that we haven't really gotten into at all. One of the most remarkable changes in the industry over the last several years has been the increase in the use of prepaid contracts versus postpaid term contracts. And that's really a sea change in this industry.
Thanks, guys. And we are starting to run a little bit short on time, so let me open up to the audience if anybody has questions. And if you could please identify yourself.
Yu Ting Wan with Communications Daily. So AT&T has filings at 5 states, and some of the filings are just a notice to confirm that they will need state commission approval. And I think Spring is asking the West Virginia Commission to launch an investigation into the merger. So my question is, what is the state commission and state agents' role in the merger, and how would that affect the overall merger review process?
I'll take that question, at least be the first responder to it. In fact, in my notes for speaking this morning, I had a section on state processes, and they will. Some states will get involved. Most states will not get involved. The reason that most states won't get involved is because of funding, which is a major state problem. The states that get involved are usually states like California, the California PUC, California Public Utilities Commission, and the New York Public Utilities Commission. And they have experts in the regulation of the telecommunications information entertainment industry, and they can not only work independently of the FCC, but cooperatively with the FCC as the FCC proceeds, and they can openly discuss condition ideas, rejection ideas, things like that. So there will be some collaboration by the FCC with some of these states that you already have enumerated, but specifically the larger, better funded, more expert states, because they realize, as everybody on this panel realizes, that these services are local, regional, national, and global. And it begins with someone picking up a handset or attaching a computer to the network at some residence that's local. And so they have a responsibility to protect the local ratepayers in concert with the FCC. It is a dual system, a two-tiered system of regulation in this country. The primary regulator on interstate and international calls is, of course, the FCC. The primary regulator on local calls is the State Public Utilities Commission.
And just to add to that, most states have a similar setup with the federal government. You have a Public Utilities Commission, and you also have the state's equivalent of the Department of Justice, the State Attorney General. And many states likely will be working through their Attorney General's offices with the Department of Justice, participating in the investigation. The Department of Justice will take the lead role in that investigation, but the states will be there along with the DOJ throughout the process, conducting interviews with companies that might be affected and customers that might be affected to build up a factual record. Typically, if the DOJ does bring suit to block the transaction or brings suit to block the transaction but files a consent decree settling the transaction, the states typically will file onto that. If they disagree with the outcome that the Department of Justice comes to, the states can independently bring suit. They would typically make that decision once the DOJ has made its decision.
I have to affirm that, and I should have mentioned it myself. And for example, the states' attorneys general are continuing actions against Microsoft as we sit here, that the Antitrust Division of the Justice Department terminated its inquiry into Microsoft's alleged anti-competitive behavior years ago.
And the prior consent decree with Microsoft just expired.
Exactly. So it's more than a two-tier system. It becomes a three-tier system.
And we have, sorry, I'm in back now, everybody. We have a question from Politico.
Hi, Eliza Craigman with Politico. Is there any precedent for mergers becoming too expensive because of the conditions? I'm wondering if there could be enough conditions placed on it that that would possibly end it with more than AT&T would be willing to pay. If there are any precedent for that, and if you think that's possible in this particular transaction.
Absolutely. Absolutely, it is something that can and does happen. In the context of settlement negotiations with the Department of Justice, firms are always expressing concern about the cost of any requirements that DOJ might be placing on or seeking from the firms in order to settle concerns that the department has in order to not block the transaction. And there have been transactions where the parties have decided to walk away, either because DOJ says, if you proceed with this, we're going to sue to block it, or we're going to require certain divestitures or other conditions from you. Whether or not that's likely to happen in this case, it would be speculation largely. AT&T has created the interesting situation with the forfeiture clause should the transaction not go through, which does increase the cost of any decision not to proceed.
In fact, in the merger agreement, there is a clause that deals with how the expenses of some kind of a settlement agreement up to a certain level, and I don't want you to report on this because it's by my memory, but I think it's around 3.8 billion or 3.4, up to a certain level that would be assumed by AT&T, and then above a certain level it would be shared. So it isn't the forfeiture clause that would come into, if AT&T and T-Mobile accept conditions that have a monetary value to them, there is in the merger agreement a way in which that would be allocated.
And because I feel that I have an answer to a question that's not been asked yet, but I expected, which is a kind of a follow-on to your question, have the Justice Department and the Federal Communications Commission collectively rejected a major deal bigger than this in the last 10 to 15 years? And the answer to that is yes, because I worked on against confirmation or approval of that deal, and that it was the $129 billion deal in 2000 when Bernie Ebbers, now serving in Club Fed, you may recall, bid $129 billion for Sprint, which has been criticized by some people this morning for getting involved in bad deals. Actually, the Antitrust Division of the Justice Department, the Federal Communications Commission, the European Union all rejected that deal, and we all know what happened to Bernie Ebbers, and now MCI WorldCom is a part of Verizon. So there is life after death.
Let me pitch a question, Ernesto. You're not going to like this, but presuming for the moment that the deal were to go through, what would be 2 to 3 of the most important conditions that would need to be placed on it?
I can't say 2 to 3 because that would be the top 2 or 3.
Okay, the top 2.
Yeah, I mean, just kind of agreeing with Carissa is the issue is there would be so many conditions you'd have to come up with because you're entering a highly regulated duopoly market. Just like we had in the 80s. So price controls would be one. You'd have to revisit the net neutrality rules and make them identical to wireline. The arguments that AT&T made during last year was, it's a nascent market. It needs to be, treated lightly on the regulatory front. I think those would be 2.
Well, roaming.
Well, and of course, roaming. But again, if you have roaming, who you're roaming with, there's no one left, right? You're roaming with Verizon.
Well, there will be MVNOs, mobile.
I think you'd have to have
virtual
a resale condition in there. I think we talked about the wholesale market.
And handset exclusivity.
So
I think going to the question of Gus just made a mention of this of market share isn't everything. Well, market share is everything when you talk about handsets. There's a reason why Apple went to AT&T and Verizon, and I think the questions that were coming up at the hearing last week was, would you be willing to give up your exclusivity? And they, Randolph Stevenson made no agreement whatsoever to that, and that's because that gives them substantial power in the market.
Can I add on a few conditions? Just give the rural guys here a little minute here.
Absolutely.
I think Randall Stevenson already said at the Senate hearing that he would not take USF support, so that would be one of the conditions I think that we would seek as well. On the data roaming side, I think it has to be more than just other carriers, and from a rural perspective, other rural carriers being able to roam on AT&T. I think it also has to be that AT&T can't block their customers from roaming on rural carriers, because if they would stop blocking that ability of their customers to roam on rural carriers' networks, those rural carriers would have revenue that they don't have that would mean less USF that they need to request. And so that's a symbiotic relationship, and that's something that I think is imperative, and it's good for consumers as well. And I think resale has to be. We had the FCC sunset the resale requirements when we had more than 2 carriers back from the 80s, and we're going back to 2 carriers. And I think there has to be a resale requirement, not just on AT&T, but I think Verizon has to be a part of this as well. And I'm not sure how you capture them under this transaction, but I think there needs to be a rulemaking to establish resale if we're going to this duopoly.
I agree with Debbie. Resale and shared use would come back, but in the larger picture, rigid regulation on the part of the Federal Communications Commission would return. I've said many times, only in America can we put Humpty Dumpty back together again. In beginning with the modification of final judgment January the 8th, 1982, resulting in the breakup of AT&T in January of 84, we split asunder a company that is now assiduously being put back together. What are the broad implications of that for the American consumer and the global consumer as well? And what are the implications for the regulatory structures, not just the antitrust, but predominantly, this is a state issue, to go back to a previous question. The states may be going in this direction. If approved, it then puts me again under a regulatory burden that I've escaped from since post breakup of AT&T. The structure of the industry, if it consolidates, then regulation will return. And I always assumed, again, as an American by choice, that in this country we prefer the light-handed regulatory method and encourage competition. If competition is diminished, then regulation has to come back, because you need referees and umpires on the competitive battlefield, which is not a level playing field. And it's not free enterprise, it's regulated enterprise.
So if I
have absolutely no problem with appropriate regulation, and in fact, in many states and at the FCC, the CWA has been very strong for the kinds of consumer protections and regulation we need. But I think let's not see that we are at a point where we're going back to an AT&T that controlled the local long distance and equipment market. We have a vibrant competitive market in equipment manufacture. In terms of data, we have multiple companies that are competing to provide, whether it's backbone or last mile connectivity for data connections. In terms of voice, we have multiple companies that are competing, both retail and wholesale. So to see this as a process of putting Humpty Dumpty back together again, AT&T, given that we represent the workers in the industry, we know who we represent and who we don't. And I would say that right now, there are quite a number of competitors in this industry who are not part of what you're implying would be a putting AT&T back together again. So I think it's a false, and I think there are a number of things that are discussed that the FCC needs to look at very carefully and put consumer protections where needed. The one thing that I do not want to go down the path is any kind of encouragement of what I call resale competition. We've been down that path before. It was a big mistake. It leads to capital freeze because companies are not going to invest in networks if then they have to resell them at what is yesterday's hypothetical most efficient cost. What we want to be encouraging in this country, and we have been in this past decade, is vibrant, multi-platform, multi-technology competition. We need to get back to a period where we're encouraging investment in robust, really high-speed wired connections to the home, because no matter what, even with this combination of spectrum, we will always have spectrum capacity limits, and the way you deal with that is getting it out of the air and into the wire as soon as possible, which means we need dense cell sites, needs much, much more fiber built both to cell towers, to home, to residents, to buildings. But we have a vibrant competitive market now, and we will after this merger.
Can I just comment just real quick?
Brief, quickly. We have one more question.
I'll keep it at the 30 seconds. The vibrant competitive market. How many people in the audience here think that Cincinnati Bell is a vibrant competitor to AT&T, which is listed in their public interest filing, or Clearwire, or LightSquared, which doesn't exist yet, has zero market share? I think Justin made it pretty clear. Like, the real only competitor left to AT&T is Verizon. And what does that mean? That means one company is competing against one company. That's a duopoly. We may not be completely back in the 70s, not in every aspect. In terms of a monopoly market, you look at the GSM market and GSM roaming. That's a monopoly after this merger. But we are going back to the 80s, where you have two companies that control somewhere in the vicinity of 88% of the profits in the wireless market and over 80% of the market share.
Just want to add on that GSM market thing. Remember the large member I told you had that had 70,000 becomes the third largest GSM carrier after this deal goes through.
And one last question.
Hi, Costa Leo Piros, Sunfire Group. I want to second the comment by Ms. Gold about the need for a dense fiber network, because that's really critical to supporting a dense wireless network, supporting broadband. People forget about that. It's really the wireless network, the wired network is really the basis of everything. But my question for the group, maybe perhaps starting with Dr. Pierce, is just an observation. We started with 2 wireless carriers in the 80s. And now people are commenting we're going to go back to 2 dominant carriers. Process of 30 years and very expensive process of transformation, a lot of transaction costs. If that indeed happens, what have we accomplished through this very expensive and long process?
First of all, nearly every process in the industry, which we're discussing this morning, is very, very expensive. Whether that expense is justified or not is open to public debate. But going back to the beginning of wireless, I was the FCC chairman's representative on the Spectrum Management Task Force when we developed the dual policy that you just referred to, the duopoly. And we made decisions that were based on the information that we had at that time. AT&T had a monopoly, and I think you are probably aware that under FCC review, beginning with the first Nixon administration, that monopoly began to be challenged by various parties. MCI, what became Sprint, which was Southern Pacific Railroad. And so we were reactive, we were not proactive to those issues. So the issues were raised by American businesses wanting to compete with AT&T. When we then evolved and looked at the future of wireless, we said that the competition, less regulation and competition would be better. And that's how the duopoly evolved. And now you're accurately perhaps forecasting that will return if this deal is approved. But in the meantime, what have we accomplished? We accomplished a plethora of benefits that we haven't time to discuss this morning, but certainly an explosion of not just equipment, but applications, because it was a market that was open. It wasn't dominated by one company. And you can have emerging competition like that explodes technology and applications based upon technology, and then comes back, which is what we're seeing. It's an evolutionary process. It's Darwinian capitalism, for want of a better phrase. So I don't pass judgment on what has happened historically. I view it and then say, what are the lessons of what you characterize as perhaps a waste of money to reach a conclusion that we began 20 or 30 years ago. I don't view it that way. I view it that there are some benefits and some costs, and that's the way the cookie crumbles, as we say in the United States, or that's the way the banana splits. Those are two of my favorite. They never use them in Great Britain because they won't know what the hell you're talking about. I do, though. I'm bilingual.
I just want to take 10 seconds to say in the last 30 years, I think, I would argue that when cellular started, we started with very local markets, and what's been put back together is a very national market. And in the meanwhile, we've had some very innovative companies come into being. One of them is T-Mobile, and I think T-Mobile if it's allowed to continue to exist on its own or with other investors, could still be a very innovative company. They have lots of employees that work really hard. They have fan sites. I've never seen so much love go out from consumers to a company before. They've won lots of awards for their consumer efforts and that sort of thing. Sprint also has been very innovative, and when we started out in the digital world, Sprint was the first one to go digital from analog. So I think that's some things that we have to keep in mind. And I'd say ask yourselves this: what has AT&T and Verizon done that's been truly innovative in the last 30 years?
I really like this question in part because it gives me an opportunity to give my response, a part of my response to the last question that I didn't have a chance to give, which is this is not that. This is not 1978 with Carter Phone, a vertically integrated industry. This is not 1993 or pre-1993 moving us back to the same sort of, even if we do end up hypothetically with only an AT&T or Verizon, only a duopoly situation in this market, would not be the pre-1993 duopoly that we had, because the nature of the technology and the nature of the market is really very, very different. You need to look at the economics of the market and the different uses that we see with these devices as we transition to more and more data-based wireless services. The most inelastic, inframarginal of those uses is voice. Voice uses a minuscule amount of data relative to all other uses. So the other uses, the watching, streaming YouTube videos, high definition video on your cell phone, those will be the marginal uses. And you might see higher prices there, maybe that will be how things evolve, but fundamentally the inframarginal and the highly inelastic services where we have the greatest historic concern about monopolist sort of behavior. As we transition to data, it's hard to imagine that that will be a concern. And even if, to put the point of this, even if we have only Verizon and AT&T, you have Skype, you have Google Voice, you have an easy ability for new entrants offering data-only voice services and data-only video services to come in and participate in this market in a way that really, I think, addresses a large number of those concerns. And fundamentally, this also is a network industry.
Skype is now becoming Microsoft.
Right, it's being purchased by Microsoft. This is fundamentally a network industry. With most network industries, at the outset, you do want a large number of competitors developing the technology, assembling the networks, figuring out what works best. That's not where we started with this industry, which is atypical, it's peculiar. After the introduction of the PCS spectrum, we got there where we had a large number of companies that fostered innovation. They were a test bed for development and growth and dynamic competition. And you would expect an industry like this to consolidate to a small number of players because it is, again, a network industry with massive benefits to consolidation. And yes, I should say concerns about consolidation. Consolidation is not uniformly good, but in industries like this, there are real benefits to it.
I think the fact that if you have a duopoly, you won't see duopoly harms. I'm not sure how much I give credence to that. The examples of Skype and Google Voice are great because those are things that AT&T has blocked. The fact that you're going to get to watch YouTube if you have a duopoly. I mean, let's not forget that when Steve Jobs, largest technology company in the world, had to bargain and negotiate with AT&T to allow YouTube to actually work on that iPhone. If AT&T had half the market and Verizon already turned down the iPhone, move us back 3 years, you just would not have a functional iPhone. I mean, when you have two gatekeepers and they would rather have you not use as much data because that would be cheaper than them investing in those networks to be more competitive, I can't imagine how it would be a good situation for anyone here.
I just want to point out that Verizon's response to AT&T's blocking of Skype was to enter a deal with Skype. So that's competition that you see between these two firms. And that AT&T's decision, you can now use Skype on AT&T phones.
And with that, I'm afraid that we're going to have to cut it off. We're running a little bit over time here. Everybody, please give a warm round of applause to the panelists today. And I will turn it back over to Sylvia.
Thank you, Jonathan. And I just wanted to point out again our upcoming events, the Broadband Breakfast Club, the National Broadband Map, Policy Consumer and economic implications on June 21st, and making the Universal Service Fund into a Universal Broadband Fund July 19th. Please give a hand again for our sponsors, ICF International, NCTA, TIA, and US Telecom.